The morning Eva Bancroft walked into the sheriff's office of Redrock, Texas. She had every intention of walking back out a free woman, but the year was 1882, and intentions rarely counted for much when a man held a badge and a grudge in equal measure. She had ridden 3 days through the hill country south of San Antonio, through mesquite flats that shimmered like broken glass under the August sun, through creek crossings where the water barely reached her horse's fetlocks because the drought had swallowed everything it could reach. She had ridden with a saddlebag full of documents, land deeds, water rights certificates, a letter from a judge in Austin, all of it proof that the Bancroft homestead, the one her father had bled and sweated over for 22 years, belonged to her and not to the Consolidated Land and Cattle Company of Texas, which was a grand name for what amounted to 6 men in expensive suits who had decided that small ranchers and homesteaders were an inconvenience to be absorbed or eliminated. Eva was 26 years old, brown-haired and sun-darkened, with green eyes that her mother had called argument eyes, because they never looked away and never admitted defeat. She was not a particularly large woman, but she carried herself the way certain rivers carry themselves, quietly, steadily, and with an absolute certainty about where they were going, even when the terrain disagreed. The sheriff of Redrock was a man named Calhoun, and Sheriff Calhoun had 3 interests in life: his salary, his comfort, and whatever the Consolidated Land and Cattle Company told him to think. He was a heavy man with a walrus mustache and small eyes that had the particular quality of always seeming to look at something just past your shoulder, as though he was perpetually waiting for someone more important to arrive. Eva laid her documents on his desk. He looked at them with the expression of a man regarding something mildly distasteful left on his boot. "Miss Bancroft," he said, "these papers don't change the situation as it currently stands. These papers are signed by Judge Harlan of the 4th District Court in Austin," she said. "They establish that the deed my father registered in 1860 is valid and that the company's claim is fraudulent. The company has its own papers. The company's papers were filed 6 months ago based on a survey that was conducted on land the company does not own. That is called fraud, Sheriff. It is illegal. I believe you are familiar with the concept, given your occupation." Calhoun's eyes finally found her face. They did not like what they found there. "You're a mouthy woman," he said. "I'm a woman with legal documentation and a great deal of patience, but even my patience has a bottom to it, and I am fairly close to that bottom right now." What happened next happened very quickly, the way things in the West tended to happen when power met inconvenience and decided to simplify the situation. A deputy appeared from a back room, then another. Calhoun stood up. He said something about disturbing the peace and obstruction, and a few other words that were technically legal but practically meaningless. And before Eva fully understood what was occurring, she was standing in the single cell of the Redrock jailhouse with iron bars between herself and her saddlebag full of documents, which were now sitting on Calhoun's desk. "You cannot do this," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady, which was remarkable because inside her chest something was collapsing. "I just did," Calhoun said and walked away. That was a Thursday. The man responsible for putting her in that cell was not, in any technical sense of the word, Sheriff Calhoun. Calhoun was merely the instrument. The architect was a man named Stephen Stone, and Eva knew his name well, because it was Stephen Stone who had filed the fraudulent survey, Stephen Stone who had presented those false documents to the Territorial Land Office, and Stephen Stone who was, as far as she understood it, the primary agent of the Consolidated Land and Cattle Company in the Hill Country region. She had never met him. She had only heard his name spoken with bitterness around the kitchen tables of a dozen families who had lost land or water rights, or both, to the company's expanding appetite. She had built a picture of him in her mind over the course of a year, hard, calculating, perhaps handsome in the way that dangerous things are sometimes handsome, utterly without conscience, The kind of man who had made peace with his own corruption so thoroughly that he had stopped noticing it. She had not expected him to walk into the jailhouse on Friday morning with a cup of coffee. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two more. He was lean and dark-haired, with the kind of face that would have been purely attractive if it had not been carrying something heavy behind the eyes. He wore a decent coat, well cut but trail dusty, and his boots were good quality but worked, not decorative. He carried 2 cups of coffee, which was strange, and he set one down on the small shelf that jutted through the bars of her cell. "Miss Bancroft," he said. She looked at the coffee and then at him. "Stephen Stone," she said. He did not seem surprised that she knew his name. "Calhoun told me you came in with papers. Calhoun stole my papers. Calhoun is holding them as evidence." "Evidence of what precisely?" "Evidence that my father legally owned land and that your company fraudulently attempted to claim it." Stephen Stone looked at her for a long moment. He had not yet touched his own coffee. His eyes were dark, a very particular shade of dark brown that in certain lights looked almost black, and they had the quality she had not anticipated. They looked directly at her, and they looked, she thought, uncomfortable. Not guilty, not exactly, but uncomfortable. "I came to discuss a settlement," he said. "I am in a jail cell." "I know. You put me here. Calhoun put you here. On your company's instruction." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't instruct him to arrest you. I instructed him to prevent you from filing those papers with the land office. Those are not meaningfully different outcomes from where I am standing." He picked up his coffee cup, set it down again without drinking. "The settlement I am authorized to offer is fair compensation for the land based on current market value. The land is not for sale. Miss Bancroft, my father is buried on that land," she said, and her voice did something she had not given it permission to do. It cracked, just slightly at the edge, the way ice cracks in early spring when the warmth first touches it. "My mother is buried there. I planted their graves with the flowers my mother brought from Kentucky in a tin box on a wagon in 1858. The land is not for sale. It is mine. It is lawfully mine. And if you had one honest bone remaining anywhere in your body, you would know that." Something happened in Stephen Stone's face. It was brief and quickly controlled, but she saw it, a sort of flinching, not physical but interior, the way a man flinches when something true finds him in a place he thought was well defended. He stood up. "I'll be in town until Monday," he said. "The offer stands." He left. He left the second cup of coffee on her shelf. She drank it because she was thirsty, and because refusing it would have accomplished nothing practical. And Eva Bancroft was, above all things, practical. The cell was small. It had a cot with a blanket that smelled of dust, a slop bucket, and a window the size of a Bible set high in the east-facing wall. The window let in a rectangle of light in the mornings that moved like a slow clock across the dirt floor, and Eva used it to track the hours. She was not afraid of Calhoun. She was afraid of time, afraid that while she sat here, the company would move the survey markers again, file another fraudulent deed, do something irrevocable and expensive to undo. Fear of that kind was the productive sort, the kind that kept your mind sharp and working. She spent the first afternoon composing, in her head, a letter to Judge Harlan. She spent the first evening thinking about water. Her father had always said that in the Texas Hill Country, land was not really about the land. It was about the water beneath it. The Bancroft property sat above a good spring-fed creek that ran year-round, even in droughts like this one. That was why the company wanted it. That was why the company had sent Stephen Stone. She thought about Stephen Stone. She thought about him more than she intended to, which irritated her considerably. She thought about the way he had set down that second cup of coffee. She thought about that flinch, that small interior collapse. She thought about the fact that he had come himself, rather than sending Calhoun or a lawyer or a letter. A man entirely without conscience would have sent a letter. A man without conscience would not have brought 2 cups of coffee. She could not afford to find him interesting. He had put her in a jail cell. Whatever complexity existed behind his dark eyes was his own problem to solve, not hers. He came back Saturday morning, again with coffee. "You are either very confident or very guilty," she said when she saw him, "to keep coming back here." He sat down on the wooden chair outside her cell. He had a different look about him this morning, less composed, as though the Friday had used him up somewhat. "I found out last night that Calhoun is planning to send a wire to the land office on Monday claiming your documents were forgeries," he said. "If they process the company's claim before your papers are reviewed, my papers which Calhoun stole." "Yes. And you are telling me this why?" He looked at the floor for a moment. The morning light was coming through the jailhouse door, which stood open because the August heat was already pressing, and it fell across the side of his face in a way that made him look younger than 30, made him look, she thought, like someone who had started down a road a long time ago without fully understanding where it went. "I am telling you this," he said slowly, "because I looked up your father's original deed yesterday evening. I had access to the county records, and your documentation is correct. The 1860 registration is valid. Our survey was conducted on the wrong parcel. He stopped. I made a mistake. Or rather, I took measurements and filed documents based on information that I was given by the company, and I did not verify that information carefully enough, and that was wrong." Eva was very still. "Are you telling me," she said, "that you filed a fraudulent land claim by accident?" "I am telling you that I filed a claim based on information that turned out to be false, and that when I first filed it, I believed it was legitimate. I am telling you that over the past several months, evidence has accumulated that suggested the information I was given was not accurate, and I did not act on that evidence quickly enough. And I am telling you that last night, looking at your father's deed, I no longer have any reasonable doubt." He met her eyes. "I am not a good man, Miss Bancroft, but I am trying to be an accurate one." "There is a difference," she said, "between not being good and being willing to harm people for money." "Yes," he said, "there is." They looked at each other through the iron bars for a long moment. "What are you going to do about it?" she asked. "I am going to ride to San Antonio today and send a wire to the land office myself, explaining that the company's survey contains errors and requesting a stay on any proceedings until a full review can be conducted." He paused. "It will likely cost me my position with the company." "Good," she said, and then, because she was honest, "I mean that, and I also mean thank you." He stood up. He picked up his hat from his knee and turned it in his hands. "I'm sorry you're in this cell. Get me out of it. I don't have the authority to order Calhoun, then find a way." He looked at her and she looked at him, and something passed between them through those iron bars that she could not have named then and would spend months afterward trying to find the right word for. It was not romance, not yet, not in that moment. It was something older and simpler than romance. It was recognition. Two people seeing each other clearly for perhaps the first time in the most inconvenient possible circumstances. He left. She watched the rectangle of light move across the floor of her cell. He was back by midday, and he had with him a man she did not recognize, a tall, raw-boned fellow in a good suit with a lawyer's careful way of holding himself. "This is Mr. Aldridge," Stephen said. "He's a territorial attorney. He's going to speak with Calhoun about the illegality of your detention." Eva watched through the bars as Mr. Aldridge had a very quiet, very pointed conversation with Sheriff Calhoun that lasted approximately 15 minutes. She could not hear all of it, but she heard phrases. "Habeas corpus," and 4th District jurisdiction, and "Judge Harlan is a personal acquaintance of mine, and I would be very interested to examine the circumstances under which those documents came to be on your desk." Calhoun's face went through a remarkable variety of expressions. At 3 in the afternoon on Saturday, a deputy opened Eva's cell door and handed back her saddlebag with her documents inside it, only slightly disordered. She walked out into the August sunlight of Redrock, Texas, and took what felt like her first full breath in 2 days. Stephen Stone was standing in the street. He looked like a man waiting for a verdict. "The wire has been sent," he said. "The land office will process a stay by Monday. Your homestead is safe for now, at least until a proper review." "For now," she said. I'll testify if it comes to that, about what I know of the company's methods, about the survey." She looked at him. The afternoon sun was brutal and bright, the kind of light that stripped away pretension and left only the bones of things. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had done something that cost him something real and was not yet sure what he felt about that. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because it's right." That's a simple answer for a complicated situation. Most right things are simple, it's the doing of them that gets complicated. She ought to have walked away. She had her documents, she had a horse, she had a 3-day ride back to her homestead. She had won, or something like won, or at least the beginning of winning, and the intelligent thing would have been to consolidate that victory and go home. Instead she said, "Have you eaten?" He blinked. "I'm sorry, eat food today." "I know I have not." "Then you had better eat something before you ride to San Antonio," she said. "There's a restaurant 2 doors down from the hotel. I saw it when I rode in." She walked toward it. After a moment, she heard his boots on the boardwalk behind her. The restaurant was called Me's, and Me herself was a large, good-humored woman of perhaps 50 who appeared to have cooked everything on the menu personally, and had opinions about how much of it a person should eat. She brought them both chicken and dumplings without asking, and corn bread, and sweet tea that was very sweet, and then disappeared with the efficient grace of a woman who knows when to leave well enough alone. They sat across a table from each other and ate in silence for a while. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had already said several important things and were giving those things time to settle. "How long have you worked for the company?" Eva asked eventually. 4 years, he said. "I came west from Virginia. I needed work. They offered good pay for survey work and I was good at it." He looked at his plate. "I was good at looking at the work and not at what the work was for." "What changed?" He considered this. "I went to a family's farm outside of Careville last spring to do a survey that would have displaced them. There were children. The mother came out to speak with me and she brought lemonade." He almost laughed, but it did not quite make it to his face. "Lemonade, like I was a welcome guest, like I was not there to take everything they had. And I thought, this is not a legal abstraction. This is a woman who made lemonade." Eva set down her fork. "That is when you started to doubt." "That is when I started to actually see," he said. "Doubt had been there for a while. I had just been walking around it." She looked at him across the table. In the warm interior light of Me's restaurant, with the smell of corn bread and the sound of other conversations at other tables, he looked like a different person than the agent of a rapacious land company. He looked like a man who had gotten lost and was looking at a map for the first time in years. She was not naive. She knew that a man could feel genuine remorse and still have done genuine harm. She knew that his testimony, if it came to that, would help her, but it would not undisplace the families who had already lost land. She knew that complexity did not excuse damage. She believed all of these things. She also found, sitting across from him at Me's table with sweet tea and chicken dumplings between them, that she was interested in him in a way that had nothing to do with her homestead and everything to do with the fact that he was, beneath the bad choices and the corporate employment, a person of some substance who had finally stopped running from himself. This was inconvenient information. "I should head back to my homestead tomorrow," she said. "I'll ride to San Antonio tonight," he said. "The wire needs to go first thing in the morning. You're riding through the night. It's cooler, and I don't sleep much anyway these days." She understood that. Conscience had a way of keeping a person awake once it woke up. They finished their meal. Stephen paid for it, and she let him, not because she could not pay for herself, she absolutely could, but because it seemed to matter to him to do something that's simple and useful. They stood on the boardwalk outside Me's in the last golden light of a Texas August evening, and the town of Redrock went about its Saturday business around them. Horses and wagons and the distant sound of a piano from one of the saloons, and the sky overhead turned every color a sky can turn in that particular slow drama of Texas sunsets. "Thank you," she said, "for doing what you did today." "Thank you," he said, "for not throwing that coffee cup at me through the bars." She almost smiled. I thought about it. He put on his hat. He looked at her once more, that direct, dark-eyed look that she had decided was simply his way, the way some people could not help looking at things straight on. I hope the review goes in your favor, Miss Bancroft. It will, she said. The documents are correct. I know, he said. I checked them very carefully. He walked to his horse. He mounted with the ease of a man who had spent years in the saddle, settled his hat against the evening wind, and rode south out of Redrock without looking back. Eva watched him until he was a small shape against the last glow of the horizon. She turned and went to find her own horse and her own road home. The summer moved through its blazing length, and September came with its first breath of coolness off the hills. The land office conducted its review. It took 6 weeks, and 6 weeks was a long time to live with uncertainty, but Eva had grown up with uncertainty. It was simply the weather of her life, and she managed it the way she managed most things, by working. She fixed the fence line on the south pasture. She repaired the windmill. She harvested what the drought had left of the kitchen garden, which was not much but was something. She wrote several letters to Judge Harlan and received measured, careful responses that told her, reading between the lines, that things were moving in the right direction. She thought about Stephen Stone more often than was warranted. She told herself this was natural. He was connected to the situation. He was a person of significance to the outcome. It was practical to think about a person of significance to an ongoing legal matter. This was entirely reasonable. She found herself remembering the way he had said, "I was good at looking at the work and not at what the work was for," and the honest self-knowledge in those words, and the fact that a person could only say something that true about themselves if they had spent a long time looking very hard in an uncomfortable direction. She received a letter from him in early October. She did not know quite what to do with the fact that he had written, or with the fact that her hands did something embarrassing when she opened the envelope. The letter was formal in structure. He was a precise writer, which she might have predicted, but it contained information she had not expected. He had left the Consolidated Land and Cattle Company. He had done so immediately upon returning from San Antonio, submitting his resignation in writing along with a detailed account of the methods he had witnessed and participated in over 4 years of employment, which he had sent to the 4th District Court, to Judge Harlan, and to a journalist at the San Antonio Express who covered land rights issues. He had also, he wrote, agreed to provide full testimony in any proceedings brought against the company. He was currently, he wrote, staying in a boarding house in Fredericksburg while he decided what to do next. He had some savings. He was a competent surveyor with skills that could be used honestly. He was considering whether the hill country might need an independent survey service that operated in the interest of landowners rather than corporations. He hoped, he wrote, that she was well. She read that last line 3 times. She wrote back. She told him the review was going well. She told him about the windmill repair. It had required a specific kind of ingenuity involving a piece of leather harness and a length of fence wire, and she described it in perhaps more detail than was strictly necessary. She told him that independent survey work in the hill country seemed like a thing that was genuinely needed, and that she knew several families who had land disputes that required honest measurement. She hoped, she wrote, that he was well also. He wrote back within a week. They wrote back and forth through October. The letters became longer. They became, somewhere around the 3rd exchange, something other than correspondence about a legal situation. They became the thing that people who are becoming interested in each other do when there are miles between them and no practical way to cross those miles. They built each other out of words, carefully, and with increasing attention to detail. He wrote about Virginia, about growing up in the Shenandoah Valley, about a father who had been a surveyor himself and a mother who had read everything she could find, and then complained that there was not enough. He wrote about coming west after the war years had rearranged the landscape of his life in ways he was still sorting through. He wrote, with the kind of honesty that costs something, about the choices he had made that he was not proud of, and about what it was like to finally stop making them. She wrote about her father teaching her to ride before she was big enough for the stirrups, about her mother's tin box of Kentucky flower seeds, about learning to read legal documents out of pure necessity when she was 18, and the first land dispute had threatened the property. She wrote about what it felt like to love a piece of land, not sentimentally but specifically, the way you love things you have worked to keep, the way you love things that have your dead buried in them. He wrote, "I have been thinking about something you said in the restaurant, that most right things are simple, and it's the doing of them that gets complicated. I think I may have had that backwards for a long time. I convinced myself the situation was complicated and that gave me permission to avoid the simple thing." She wrote, "Most people do that. It requires considerable courage to stop." He wrote, "I do not think I am courageous. I think I simply reached the point where the other option became unbearable." She wrote, "I think that might be exactly what courage is." The land review came back in her favor on the 12th of November. She received the official documents on a Thursday morning, standing at her front door in her work clothes with hay in her hair, and she read them 3 times and then sat down on her porch steps and cried, which she had not done since her father died. She cried quietly and efficiently, the way she did most things, and then she went inside, washed her face and wrote 2 letters. One to Judge Harlan thanking him, one to Stephen Stone telling him the news. His response arrived in 4 days, which meant he must have written it the moment he received her letter. He wrote, "I am so glad. Your father's land is safe. I know that does not undo the months of uncertainty and worry, and I know my part in creating that uncertainty is not something I can simply erase. But I am glad." Then he wrote, after a space, "I have decided to establish my survey business here in the Hill Country. I have already had 2 inquiries from families in Gillespie County. I will need to find a more permanent arrangement than the boarding house. If you should happen to know of any property for reasonable purchase in your area, I would be grateful for the recommendation." She read that twice. Then she wrote back, "As it happens, there is a farmstead about 4 miles north of my property that has been empty since the Hensley family sold last year and moved to San Angelo. The land is good and the house is sound. The asking price is fair. You would be a neighbor." She held that last sentence for a moment before she sent the letter. Then she sent it anyway, because she was not a woman who shied from direct statements when direct statements were warranted. He arrived in December. He rode in on a cold gray morning with a pack horse loaded with his equipment and his books and his modest collection of worldly goods, and he appeared at her door at about 9 in the morning looking wind-burned and travel-tired and carrying, of all things, a small crate of apple seedlings wrapped carefully in burlap. "For planting in spring," he said when she looked at them. "The Hensley land has good southeastern exposure. Apples do well with southeastern exposure." She looked at him. He was standing on her porch with apple seedlings under one arm and his hat in his other hand, and there was something in his expression that was very carefully neutral, which she recognized as the expression of a person who is trying not to hope for too much. "Come in," she said. "There's coffee." He came in. He sat at her kitchen table and drank coffee, and she sat across from him, and it was different from Me's restaurant in Redrock. It was more immediate, more real, the 2 of them without the mediation of a crisis or iron bars or the careful formality of letter writing. It was just him and her and a kitchen table and December light through the window. They talked for 3 hours. They talked about the survey business and the Hill Country families and the ongoing legal proceedings against the Consolidated Land and Cattle Company, which had quietly begun to collapse under the weight of Stephen's testimony and several other pieces of evidence that had come to light. They talked about his plans for the Hensley property. They talked about apples. He stayed for supper. She made a plain meal, beans and salt pork and biscuits, and he ate it with the appreciation of a man who had been eating boarding house food for months. When he left, in the early dark of a December evening, he paused at her door with his hat in his hands again. "Eva," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name and she noticed it. "Yes," she said. "I want you to know coming here to this county, setting up the business nearby, I am not presuming anything. I understand that you are—" He stopped, tried again. "I do not want you to feel that I have placed expectations on Stephen," she said. "Yes, you brought apple seedlings." He was quiet. "A man does not bring apple seedlings to a property 4 miles from a woman's farm if he is not presuming anything at all," she said. "He brings apple seedlings because he is hoping to stay, and because he is hoping, perhaps, to have a reason to be nearby." She looked at him steadily. "I am not objecting to the apple seedlings." The careful, neutral expression on his face changed. Something came through it that was warmer and younger and more uncertain, and she liked it considerably better. "Good night, Stephen," she said. "Good night, Eva," he said, and he smiled for the first time. A real smile, not the managed professional kind, but the kind that a person cannot quite help. And he went down her porch steps and rode north into the dark December toward the Hensley property. And Eva Bancroft stood in her doorway and watched him go and thought, well, winter in the hill country was mild by the standards of elsewhere but sharp enough, and they fell into a comfortable pattern of mutual proximity. He was 4 miles north. She was 4 miles south. There were fences that needed discussing, and a water question about a shared seasonal creek, and a family named Munoz 6 miles east who needed survey work done, and whose situation Eva had recommended Stephen for. And these were all perfectly practical reasons to see each other with some regularity. She brought him food occasionally, because a man establishing a new business in the middle of winter was busy and not always sensible about eating. He appeared at her place with regularity on Sundays, because Sunday was a reasonable day for neighbors to exchange visits and discuss matters of mutual interest. This was all entirely practical. He rode with her in January through the back pastures of her property when she was checking fence line after a cold snap, and they rode side by side through the dry winter grass with their breath making small clouds in the still air. And they talked about everything, about books, about the law, about what the hill country had been like before the big cattle companies arrived, about what they both thought it could be. He had a particular quality in conversation of actually listening, not waiting for a pause to speak, but genuinely attending to what she said, and this was something she had not encountered often enough in her life to take it for granted. She trusted him. She did not arrive at that trust easily or quickly. She had good reasons to be careful with her trust, and Stephen Stone had given her specific and personal reasons to be cautious. But she watched him over those winter months with the practical attention she gave to everything. And what she saw was a man who was consistently the same person whether he was speaking to her, or to the Munoz family, or to old Mr. Ketterer who ran the feed store in town, and who did what he said he would do, and who asked nothing of her that she had not indicated she was willing to give. He kissed her for the first time in February, on a cold, clear evening after Sunday supper at her kitchen table, when they were standing on her porch looking at a sky full of stars that the winter had polished to exceptional brightness. He asked, which she appreciated, a simple, quiet "may I?" that she answered simply and quietly. The kiss was brief and careful and tasted of coffee and something warmer than coffee, and when they separated she looked at him in the starlight and he looked at her, and they were both, she noticed, smiling. "I have been wanting to do that since about the 3rd letter," he said. "I have been expecting you to do it since the apple seedlings," she said. He laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and she thought she would like to keep hearing that laugh for a very long time. Spring came. The apple seedlings went into the Hensley property's good southeastern soil. The legal proceedings against the Consolidated Land and Cattle Company ground slowly forward, and then, in April, suddenly accelerated when a former company executive agreed to testify against the board of directors in exchange for a reduced judgment against his personal assets. Stephen's testimony was central to the case. He rode to San Antonio twice in April and once in May, and Eva worried about him in a way that she recognized as the particular worry of a person who has begun to think of someone as essential. He came back from the May trip with news and with something else, a bunch of wildflowers that he had apparently gathered along the road, bluebonnets and paintbrush, which were the colors of the Texas spring, and he brought them to her door on a Saturday afternoon and said, "The judge ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. The company is finished. They are selling off their fraudulent claims and the land will go back to the families." She took the wildflowers. She looked at them and at him. "All the families?" she asked, "including the ones they already displaced?" "There will be a process," he said. "Restitution payments, land returns where possible. It won't be perfect. Some people lost years they can't get back, but it's as much justice as that particular system can manage." She nodded. It was not enough, and they both knew it, and they both also knew it was more than nothing, which was what there had been before. "That is good," she said. "That is genuinely good." "I thought you would want to know immediately," he said, and he was still holding his hat, which was, she had come to understand, his particular nervous habit, something he did with his hands when he felt the outcome of a moment was uncertain. "Come in," she said. "We should celebrate with something better than Sunday coffee. I have a bottle of cider that Mrs. Munoz gave me at Christmas that I have been saving for a worthy occasion." She put the bluebonnets and paintbrush in a jar of water on her kitchen table, and they drank the cider and celebrated the small and imperfect victory of justice done partway, which is usually the best justice available, and the afternoon was warm and golden, and at some point they moved from the kitchen table to the porch, and at some point after that he said, quietly, with his hands still and his eyes on her, "I love you, Eva." She was quiet for a moment. Not because she did not know her own mind, she was extremely clear about her own mind, but because the moment deserved to be held for a breath before it moved forward. "I know," she said. "I love you too. I have for a while." "How long?" "The apple seedlings," she said. He took her hand. They sat on her porch in the May evening with their hands linked and the wildflowers in a jar inside and the apple saplings 4 miles north growing in good southeastern soil, and the hill country around them went about the particular business of a Texas spring, and Eva Bancroft thought, "This is enough. This is more than enough. This is the kind of thing a person doesn't dare to count on and then somehow receives anyway." That should have been the end of the urgent story, the part where everything was settled, and the life simply went forward in the good and ordinary way of people who have found each other and found their footing. But the summer of 1883 had one more thing to say. It was July, a Tuesday, deep in the worst heat of the year, when a rider came hard down the road from town and reined up at Eva's gate with lathered horse and wide eyes. "Fire," the rider said. "In town. The jailhouse." She was on her horse inside of 2 minutes. She did not think about why she went, she simply went. The way you go toward a fire, because fire in a town like Redrock could take everything if it spread, and there were people there who needed help. She smelled it before she saw it. The smoke rose in a thick dark column against the blue summer sky, visible from 2 miles out, and when she rode in she understood the situation immediately. The jailhouse, that small, solid, ugly building where she had spent 2 days of her life behind iron bars, was burning from the inside out. The fire had started in the office section and was moving fast through the dry wood. People were gathered in the street. Bucket brigades were forming, but the water supply was limited. It was drought again, always drought, and the priority was keeping the fire from the buildings on either side. Eva pulled up her horse and looked at the building. The fire was bad but not yet complete. The office was fully involved. The cell section at the back was still, as far as she could tell, not entirely gone. Sheriff Calhoun was standing in the street with his face red and his eyes watering from the smoke. He had left the company's employ along with everything else when the proceedings began, and what he was now was simply a large, frightened man watching his place of work burn. "Is anyone inside?" Eva demanded. "Deputy went in to check the cells 20 minutes ago," someone said. "Jenkins." "He hasn't come back out." Eva did not know Deputy Jenkins well. She knew him the way you know a person in a small town, his face, his name, the general outline of his life. He was maybe 25. He had a wife who was expecting a child in the fall. He had gone into the burning building to do his job. She tied her horse and took a wet cloth from a woman in the bucket brigade and moved toward the building. "Don't," someone said. She went in anyway. The interior was full of smoke, but the corridor to the cells was still passable barely and not for much longer. She moved low, the way she had heard you were supposed to move in smoke, and followed the sound of coughing. Deputy Jenkins was in the corridor down on the floor, overcome by smoke. He was alive, just barely conscious, and he was not a small man. Eva looked at him and made several rapid calculations. She found the handles of his coat. She pulled. He was heavy. He was very heavy. She moved backward, dragging him through the smoke-filled corridor, and the heat was extraordinary, and something above her made a sound she did not like. And she moved faster, and the light from the door was right there. And she pulled one more time, and they came out of the jailhouse door in a heap, she on her back and he half on top of her, and the crowd made a sound she could not describe. She lay on the ground in the street with smoke in her lungs and gasped. People were taking the deputy from her, pulling him clear, calling for a doctor. Stephen was there. She did not know when he had arrived. He must have ridden in behind her or perhaps ahead of her. She had not seen him, but he was there, crouching over her, his face very serious and also very frightened. "Eva," he said. "Eva, look at me." "I am looking at you," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. "Are you hurt?" "No, mostly not. My hands." She looked at her hands, which had rope-burn-type abrasions from his coat handles. "Minor. Is Jenkins alive?" "Yes." "The doctor has him." "Good." She sat up with his help. She coughed. He put his arm around her. She leaned into him, which was not something she did usually without thinking, but she did it without thinking, and he held on. The crowd was still there, watching the building burn, watching the bucket brigade do its best with too little water. But several people were looking at her, and she realized with a kind of delayed understanding what she had just done, and that it looked extraordinary from the outside, going into a burning building to pull a man out. One of those people was a man she recognized slowly through the smoke and the crowd. A man who had also come at the news of the fire, who was also standing in the street watching. Calhoun. He was looking at her. His expression was complicated in a way she had not expected from him. He was not a man who usually showed much inner complexity on his face. But he looked at her, and at the deputy being tended to by the doctor, and at the burning jailhouse that had been his domain, and then he looked at her again. He crossed the street. He stopped in front of her and Stephen. "Miss Bancroft," he said. His voice was different from the voice he had used when he locked her in that cell. That voice had been the voice of a man with power he had borrowed from other people. This voice was just a man's voice. "You went in there for Jenkins." "Yes," she said. "He's the one who locked your cell door," Calhoun said. "He was the deputy on duty when you came in." She had not known that specifically. It did not matter. "He is a person," she said, "and he had a wife expecting a child." Calhoun was quiet for a moment. His mustache moved. Something in his face that had been held tightly for a very long time seemed to release slightly, like a knot given a fraction of slack. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the arrest, for what was done to you and your property." It was not a perfect apology. It was a small and belated apology from a man who had acted badly for a long time. She could have rejected it. She could have told him that apologies from people who only offer them when their comfortable position has collapsed are worth very little. She said, "I know," and then, because she was who she was, "Don't do it again to someone else." He nodded. He walked away. Stephen was watching her. "What?" she said. "You," he said. "You are remarkable." "I am practical," she said. "Jenkins had a child coming. You went into a burning building. You are going to make this into something larger than it was," she said. "It is already as large as it is," he said. "You cannot make it smaller by calling it practical." She looked at him. The jailhouse was fully engulfed now, and the bucket brigade was focused on containment, and the smoke was rolling up into the blue summer sky, and her hands stung, and she was sitting in the street of Redrock, Texas, with the man she loved, and he was looking at her with an expression that she could only describe as a man who has just seen the full measure of something and been entirely overcome by it. "It is my nature," she said quietly. "I could not leave him in there." "I know," he said. "That is precisely what I mean." He held her hands carefully, looking at the abrasions. He tore a clean strip from his shirt without asking, practical and immediate, and wrapped them. "You," he said while he worked, "are the person I want beside me for the rest of my life." She looked at his bent head, at the careful way his hands worked, at the absolute certainty in his voice. "Yes," she said, "I am." He looked up. "That is an acceptance," she said, "in case you have not yet constructed the question formally." He laughed, surprised again, the way she had learned to love, and then he said, in the street of Redrock with the jailhouse burning behind them and smoke in the summer air, "Eva Bancroft, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, "but ask me again when we are not sitting in the street covered in ash." "I will ask you every day until you tell me to stop," he said. "I will never tell you to stop," she said. Deputy Jenkins recovered. His wife delivered a healthy son in September. They named him Henry. Eva and Stephen brought gifts when the baby came. A blanket she had made from wool she sheared and spun herself, and a small wooden horse that Stephen had carved over the course of a month in the evenings, which was a skill she had not known he possessed and which charmed her considerably. Jenkins shook Stephen's hand and held his wife's hand and looked at them both with the slightly overwhelmed expression of a new father who is also processing several large feelings simultaneously. "I heard what you did," he said to Eva, "in the jailhouse." "You are welcome," she said simply. "I'm sorry," he said, "for my part in locking you up." "You were doing what you were ordered to do," she said. "That is not entirely blameless, but I understand the situation you were in. Raise your son well, Deputy. That is the best thing you can do with the time." They were married in October, in the yard of her property, on a day when the hill country had decided to be exactly what it could be when it was trying. Golden light through the live oaks, a sky of that particular blue that only occurs after the first cold fronts, the smell of the cedar and the dry grass and the earth. Judge Harlan presided, making the trip from Austin for the occasion, and Mrs. Munoz and her family came, and a dozen other families from the county, and me from the restaurant in Redrock, who cried, and a handful of people from Stephen's survey work who had come to respect him during the months he had spent learning what it meant to do honest work in the hill country. Eva wore a dress she had sewn herself from blue calico, because she was practical and the hill country in October did not require silk, and because the color suited her green eyes in a way that Stephen had mentioned once and she had noted. She carried the wildflowers that were still blooming in the late fall, some asters, some late goldenrod gathered from the edges of her south pasture that morning. She walked across her own land to marry the man who had once, indirectly, put her in jail, and the afternoon was so beautiful, and the whole story was so improbable and so exactly itself, that she felt a fullness in her chest that was not sentiment but gratitude, the specific gratitude of a person who has fought hard for something and received more than they fought for. Stephen was waiting for her under the largest of the live oaks, and when he saw her crossing the field toward him, something happened in his face that was not a performance and not a social mask, and not the carefully controlled composure she had first seen in the jailhouse. It was simply the face of a man watching the person he loves walk toward him, unguarded and full. Judge Harlan said the words. They said the words back. Stephen put a ring on her finger, a simple gold band, because he had asked what she wanted and she had said simple. And she put a ring on his, because she had also bought a band for him, which surprised him, and which he told her afterward had meant more to him than almost anything else in the ceremony, the small equality of it. They had a wedding supper that half the county seemed to attend, and someone brought a fiddle, and then someone else brought a second fiddle, and the evening ended with dancing on the grass under the October stars, and it was not a grand wedding in any metropolitan sense of the word, but it was entirely, completely, correctly theirs. They lived on her property, the Bancroft land, which she kept under the Bancroft name in the deed because her father had earned that name in that land, and it deserved to stay, and Stephen maintained his survey office at the Hensley property, which became, over the first year, a proper working space with a sign and regular clients. He was, as it turned out, genuinely good at honest survey work. He had always been competent. What had changed was his commitment to accuracy over convenience, and accuracy over convenience turned out to be exactly what the families of the hill country needed. The spring after their marriage, the apple trees on the Hensley property bloomed for the first time. 6 of the 10 seedlings took properly, which Stephen declared a success rate he was pleased with, and Eva declared a good omen. She was pregnant by April. She told him on a morning when the bluebonnets had come out along the south fence line, and the world was doing its annual improbable trick of being more beautiful than memory could quite hold. She told him matter-of-factly because that was her way, standing in the kitchen, looking at him across the table, saying, "I am expecting a child. Late autumn, I think." He was very still for a moment. Then he set down his coffee cup with enormous care, as though it had become suddenly precious, and came around the table, and she stood up and he held her with the particular careful fierceness of a man who has been given something he did not dare to want. "Are you well?" he said into her hair. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am also a little sick in the mornings, but that is apparently conventional." "Whatever you need," he said. "I need you not to become absurdly cautious about me," she said. "I am healthy and capable, and I will continue to be both. I am having a child, not a calamity." He pulled back and looked at her, smiled. "You are the least calamitous person I have ever met." "Good. Remember that." The child came in November, on a cold, clear night when the stars were very bright and the cedar smell was sharp in the air. And the child was a boy, strong and loud, with Stephen's dark hair and Eva's green eyes. And they named him James Arthur Stone, James for her father, Arthur for Stevens, and Stone because the land and the name and the future were all being built together now. Stephen held his son for the first time with an expression that Eva would remember for the rest of her life. Not performed joy, but deep, quiet, overwhelming love. The kind that strips you of composure entirely and leaves you simply present. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly as though they were being introduced. James regarded him with the serious, unfocused attention of newborns. "He looks skeptical," Stephen said. "He looks like he is deciding whether to cry again," Eva said from the bed. "Give him a moment. He'll come around." The baby did not cry. He closed his fist around Stephen's finger and held on. The hill country continued to change around them as the 1880s moved forward. The big cattle companies did not disappear entirely. Greed does not disappear. It only changes form. But the legal precedent set by the proceedings against the Consolidated Land and Cattle Company made it harder to pursue the most aggressive tactics, and there were more honest lawyers in the territory than there had been, and more people willing to testify when things went wrong. Stephen's survey business became a genuine institution. He trained a young man from the Munoz family, whose name was Ernesto, who had an aptitude for the mathematical side of the work and a quiet, careful manner with clients. Eva helped with the books because she was better at numbers than almost anyone she had met, and because she enjoyed the practical satisfaction of a ledger that balanced. Eva also began, quietly and without making a particular announcement about it, to help the families in the county who had land disputes. She had her collection of documents, her working knowledge of deed law, her correspondence with Judge Harlan, and her absolute willingness to sit across from any one lawyer, sheriff, or land company agent and not look away. She did not call it legal work. She called it helping people, which is what it was. Judge Harlan called it the most effective informal advocacy he had encountered in his 20 years on the bench, which he put in a letter, which she kept. James grew into a child who was exactly as stubborn as his mother and exactly as precise as his father, which was a combination that produced a 7-year-old who could argue a position with the relentless logic of a small attorney. Stephen found this hilarious. Eva found it familiar. Their second child was born in 1887, a daughter they named Clara May, after both of their mothers, whose names had been variations of that gentle combination. Clara had Stephen's coloring but her mother's argument eyes, and the family of 4 on the Bancroft Stone property became its own small civilization, with rules and rhythms and the particular warmth of a household where both people in it have chosen each other completely. The apple trees produced their first small harvest in the fall of 1888. 6 years after Stephen had carried those burlap-wrapped seedlings across the hill country to plant in soil he was learning to call home. The apples were small and tart and imperfect, the way first harvests usually are, and Eva and Stephen and James and little Clara sat on the porch of the Bancroft house on a September afternoon and ate them. And Stephen said they were the best apples he had ever tasted, and Eva said that was clearly sentiment overriding judgment, and James said they were all right, and Clara ate 3 and fell asleep in her father's arms in the warm afternoon sun. "You are not objective," Eva told Stephen about the apples. "I am completely objective," he said. "I am a surveyor. Objectivity is my profession." "Your objectivity is compromised by the fact that you planted these trees and have been waiting 6 years for this result. The result is excellent. The result is acceptable and will improve with time." He looked at her. His dark eyes were warm with amusement and love and the particular ease of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be. "You are the only person in the world," he said, "who would argue with a man about his own apples." "Someone has to keep you accurate," she said. He reached over Clara, still asleep, on one arm and took her hand. She let him. She turned her hand and held his. The hill country in September was doing its particular seasonal business, beginning to bronze and cool after the summer's fire, and the sky above the live oaks was deepening toward the blue of evening, and down in the south pasture Eva could see James running through the dry grass after something. A grasshopper, probably, or one of the small lizards that lived in the rock piles along the fence line, with his arms out and his face intent, very small in the large landscape. Very much alive in the way children are alive in ways that adults have to work to remember. She thought about her mother's tin box of Kentucky flower seeds. She thought about her father in the ground on this land. She thought about a jail cell in August heat, and a cup of coffee set down on a shelf through iron bars, and a man who had made bad choices and then made different ones, and apple seedlings wrapped in burlap, and letters written by lamplight, and a burning building in July, and the specific weight of a person who cannot walk, and the simplicity of why you pull them out anyway. She thought about how you could not have predicted this, any of it, from any of the individual pieces. You could not have predicted from a jail cell in August that you would be sitting on your porch 5 years later with your husband and your children and apple trees and a ledger that balanced, in the life that was always, apparently, the life you were going to arrive at. She had never believed in fate, particularly. She believed in work and in honesty and in not looking away from difficult things. But she believed in this specific Thursday evening in September, with the smell of cedar and the sound of her son in the field, and the weight of her husband's hand and the soft breathing of her daughter asleep between them. "I have been thinking," Stephen said. "You are always thinking," she said. "It is one of your consistent qualities. I have been thinking about building another room on the house before winter. The children are sharing, which is fine now, but James is almost 8 and he will want his own space soon." "He will not stop talking long enough to need his own space," Eva said. "But yes, before winter if we start soon. I'll need 2 weeks if Ernesto can help." "Ernesto can help. I already asked him." Stephen turned his head to look at her. "You already asked him?" "A month ago, when I first thought of it." He shook his head, smiling. "You are frequently several steps ahead of me." "I have been several steps ahead of most situations for most of my life," she said. "It is how a person survives in this country. It is how a person flourishes," he said. There is a difference. She considered that. Flourishes. It was not a word she had applied to herself before, or to her life before this particular configuration of it. She had managed and endured and fought and held on, but flourishing was something else. Flourishing was September evenings and apple harvests and the sound of children and the hand of a person you trusted completely. Yes, she said quietly, there is. James came running back from the pasture with a lizard in his cupped hands, which he presented to his parents with the triumph of a conquistador presenting treasure. They duly admired the lizard, which was small and green, and seemed extremely unenthusiastic about its situation. James released it at Stephen's suggestion, watched it sprint back into the grass, and then settled himself on the porch steps with the satisfied expression of a child who has accomplished something real. Clara slept on. The evening came in. In the subsequent years, they built the room and planted more apple trees, and added a second survey horse to Stephen's operation, and expanded the kitchen garden to a size that produced enough to put up for winter and share with the Munoz family and the Ketterers, and the Hendersons who had moved onto the old Prescott property 2 miles east. Eva's informal advocacy work became formalized slightly when Judge Harlan recommended her to 2 other families in separate counties who needed help navigating land disputes, and she began traveling for it occasionally, a day here, 2 days there. And Stephen managed with James's help and Ernesto's when needed, and nobody in the household treated this as extraordinary, because it was not extraordinary to them. It was simply what Eva did, and what Eva did was useful, and useful things required space and support, and both of those were available. Stephen testified twice more in proceedings related to the original Consolidated Land and Cattle Company case, as the legal consequences moved through various courts over the following years. His testimony was precise and complete, and always accurately remembered, which was the testimony of a surveyor, but also, she thought, the testimony of a man who had decided to be as accurate about his past as he was about the land he measured. The company was eventually dissolved as a corporate entity. Its principals paid substantial fines. Some of them went to prison, though the prisons of that era were not sufficient punishment by the measure of the harm done. The land was redistributed imperfectly, as land always is. Some families came back. Some did not. Some of the damage was permanent, as some damage always is. Eva wrote about it in a letter to Judge Harlan. We cannot call it justice in the full sense of the word, but we can call it better than before, and better than before is what most of us are working toward on any given day. Harlan wrote back, "That is the most honest description of the law's capacity that I have encountered in 30 years on the bench. You should have been a lawyer, Mrs. Stone." She wrote back, "I am, functionally speaking, approximately one." He sent her several law volumes after that. She read all of them. The decade turned. 1890. James was 8. Clara was 3. The apple trees were producing well. The survey business was sound. The Bancroft land, her father's land, her mother's land, hers, now also Stephen's and the children's and their children's children, if everything went the way that things sometimes went, was in better condition than it had ever been, because 2 people working together toward the same end can maintain what one person struggling alone cannot always sustain. On a morning in early spring, 1890, Eva stood at the gate of her south pasture and looked at the land. The bluebonnets were just beginning, scattered red and purple and blue among the grass, and the live oaks were putting out their new leaves, and the creek that ran year-round even in drought was running well after a wet winter, and her father's grave was under the elm tree by the east fence with the Kentucky flowers her mother had planted 20 years ago, which came back every spring with the faithful indifference of nature to the passage of time. She heard boots on the path behind her, and then Stephen was beside her, with coffee for both of them because he had learned her mornings thoroughly, and knew that this was where she went to think, and that coffee was welcome here. He stood next to her and they looked at the land together. "Good spring," he said, "Very good," she said. "The creek is high, that means a good summer. The north field is ready to turn if we get a few more warm days. I know, I was thinking we might try corn in the north field this year alongside the usual. Corn is thirsty. The creek is high. Fair point." They were quiet together for a moment. The morning moved around them. Bird song and wind in the live oaks, and the distant sound of James waking up in the house. You could always tell when James was waking up because he greeted the morning the way some people greeted arguments, with immediate and full-throated engagement. "I have been thinking," Eva said. "You are always thinking," Stephen said. "It is one of your consistent qualities." She smiled at her coffee cup. "I have been thinking about what I want to do with the next 10 years, about the advocacy work, about whether there is a more structured way to do it to help more families, to do it more systematically. Like a proper office. Like a proper office. Perhaps in Fredericksburg or New Braunfels, somewhere accessible. With proper documentation and perhaps an actual lawyer involved who can do the parts I cannot technically do. You can technically do most of it. Technically and legally are different things. I want to do it properly." He was quiet for a moment, thinking she knew. He did not speak until he had thought a thing through, which was one of the things she loved about him, the care he took with his thinking. "I think that is a good idea," he said. "I think you should do it. And I think Judge Harlan would write you a letter of introduction that would open a great many doors." "I already drafted one for him to sign," she said. He turned to look at her. "Last week," she said, "when I first thought of it." "Several steps ahead," he said. "Consistently," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him, and they stood together in the spring morning looking at the land that was theirs, properly, legally, completely, with every document in order and every fraudulent claim defeated, and every crooked sheriff out of office, and the good spring creek running through the pasture, and the bluebonnets coming up between her parents' graves, and the children's voices beginning to fill the house behind them with the noise of the day's beginning. This was the life. Not the dramatic moments, not the burning buildings or the legal victories or the letters through iron bars. Those were the moments that shaped the life, that forged it and tested it and proved it. But the life itself was this. A spring morning, coffee, a man whose shoulder she could lean against, land she had fought to keep and kept, children who were loud and alive and entirely themselves, work that mattered, and ahead of her a future that contained, as far as she could see, everything she needed and a great deal she had not expected, and a fair amount she had not known enough to want until it arrived. She thought about what she would tell someone if she were asked to describe how she had come to be here. She thought she would tell them, "I was put in a jail cell by a man who turned out to be better than his choices, and I eventually loved him for the person he chose to become rather than the person those choices had briefly made him. I went into a burning building because no person deserves to burn. I held on to my father's land because it was right and because the documents were correct. I planted bluebonnets and apple trees and a life, and the life grew." That was the story told plainly. Told fully, it was this. It was every letter and every morning and every difficult conversation and every choice made toward honesty over convenience by both of them across all the years. It was two people, neither of them perfect, both of them trying, making a life in the hill country of Texas in the last fierce decades of a century that was hard and beautiful in equal measure, in a land that demanded everything you had and occasionally, if you were persistent and lucky and honest with yourself, gave you back more than you brought. The north field got planted with corn that year. It grew well. James and Clara helped with the harvest that fall. Clara mostly by eating things and James mostly by asking questions about the agricultural mechanics of it, which Stephen answered with the patient precision of a man who had learned that questions are how children build the world. The office in Fredericksburg opened in the spring of 1891, in a two-room space above a general store, with a painted sign that said, "E. Stone, Land Rights Consultation," and a letter of introduction from Judge Harlan that Eva showed to exactly the people who needed to see it and to no one else. because she had not become a woman who needed to prove herself to people who were not relevant to the work. Her first client in the office was a widow named Carmela Vasquez, who had been fighting a fraudulent land claim for 3 years. Eva sat across the table from her in that small room above the general store and listened to the full story, and then she opened the documents and read them carefully, and she said, "This claim is invalid. I will show you why, and we will file the appropriate challenge within the week." And she did. The second client was a family who had been promised water rights that were never properly recorded. The third was an elderly German immigrant farmer whose sons had been swindled by a local operator using forged signatures. Eva handled all of it with the combination of legal knowledge and relentless directness that was, by now, simply her way in the world. Stephen rode down from the Bancroft property on Fridays to bring her home for the weekends. Sometimes he brought the children if their schoolwork was done. Sometimes he brought extra corn bread from a batch he had made himself, because he had learned to bake with the same precision he brought to surveying, and the results were reliable. On the Friday evenings, when the ride home was long enough and the light was good, they talked about everything they were thinking, the way they had been talking about everything since those first letters written by lamplight in 1882. They had never stopped talking that way, carefully, honestly, with full attention. She thought it was probably the thing she was most grateful for, in the whole of it, that they had never stopped doing that. Clara started school in Fredericksburg, which made sense given how often Eva was there, and discovered at the age of 6 that she had an extraordinary memory for anything she read, which her teacher described as remarkable, and which Eva described as convenient. James, at 10, had decided he wanted to be a surveyor like his father, and spent his afternoons learning the instruments and the mathematics and the particular combination of patience and precision that the work required. Stephen taught him with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who understood that the best thing you could give a child was not the answer but the method. The years were good. Not without difficulty. There were droughts and sick livestock, and one very bad winter in 1893, when the freeze lasted 3 weeks, and they lost most of the vegetable garden and 2 of the apple trees, and they rebuilt in spring with the matter-of-fact resilience of people who have learned that rebuilding is simply part of the process. There were disputes and difficulties and the ordinary sorrows of human life. The Munoz patriarch died in 1892, which grieved Eva considerably, because he had been a good man who had treated her with respect and courtesy from the beginning, and the world had less of that than it needed and could ill afford to lose any. Mrs. Munoz continued, formidable and warm, and her son Ernesto continued working with Stephen's survey business and eventually became his partner in it. But the years were, in their essential quality, good, full. The kind of years that a person lives in rather than through. In the spring of 1895, when James was 13 and Clara was 8, and the apple trees were producing abundantly, and the Bancroft land was in its best condition in 35 years, and Eva's office had helped 63 families with land disputes and was known by reputation across 4 counties. Stephen came home from a surveying job in Kerr County on a Friday evening and tied his horse at the gate and walked up the path with the look of a man who has been thinking all day about something he wants to say. Eva was on the porch. She looked at him. She could read him as well as she could read a legal document by now, which was thoroughly and with complete accuracy. "What did you decide?" She said. He came up the steps and sat down next to her. "I was thinking about the first time I came here," he said, "with the apple trees. I remember. I was so careful, so measured, trying not to presume anything, trying to get the balance right, not sure what you thought of me or whether you should think anything good of me at all." He was quiet for a moment. "I think about that person sometimes, the one I was then, the one who had spent years not looking at what he was doing. And I think I am grateful to him for finally turning around, for bringing apple seedlings, for writing the first letter." He looked at her. "For every choice that led here." She looked at him for a long time, 13 years since the jail cell, 12 since the letters, 11 since the burning building, 10 since the wedding under the live oak. She looked at him, older now, the dark hair showing some gray at the temples, the lines around his eyes that were half from sun and half from years of thinking carefully about difficult things, and she thought about the flinch she had seen in the jailhouse, that small interior collapse when something true found him in a well-defended place. She thought about how that moment had been the beginning of everything. Not the romance, not the love, those had come later, carefully and on their own schedule. But the beginning of trust, which was the thing the love was built on. "I am grateful too," she said, "to that person, to you." He took her hand, she took his. Down in the south pasture, James was doing something with a fence post that involved more ambition than technique, and Clara was sitting under the elm tree near her grandparents' graves with a book open on her lap, oblivious to everything but the page. And the April evening was coming in golden and soft over the live oaks, and the bluebonnets were thick along the fence line, and the creek was running well, and in the morning the work would begin again. The honest, necessary, sustaining work of the life. And Eva Bancroft Stone, who had walked out of a burning jail carrying the man who had put her there, and who had been asked why, and who had said because nobody deserves to burn, was sitting on the porch of her father's land with everything she needed and nothing she needed to fight for anymore, except in the good and forward-looking way, which was not fighting at all but building. She leaned her head against Stephen's shoulder. He rested his cheek against her hair. The evening came all the way in, full and steady, over the Bancroft land and the apple trees and the graves of the parents and the voices of the children, and the shared, accumulated, deliberate life of two people who had found each other in the most improbable of circumstances, and had chosen, every day since, to be each other's home. The stars came out over the Texas Hill Country, the same stars that had been there in 1882 and would be there long past any of them, indifferent and blazing and enormous, and below them, very small and very warm and very real, the porch and the lamp in the window and the two of them together, which was enough. Which was, in fact, everything.